Good noon. Morning, noon, good noon. Good afternoon, it says on the note, so maybe I'll go there. My name is Roz Elder, Friends of the Library Board President. On behalf of the BSI Book Sandwich In Committee, I would like to welcome you to the October Book Sandwich In, sponsored by the Friends of the Tulsa City County Libraries. Today, Jake Krumwiede we'll be talking about Erik Larson's book, The Demon of Unrest. Our last talk of the year will be November 10th at this same place at 12:10, and we'll cover Jodi Picoult's By Any Other Name. I hope to see you there. That will be a wonderful talk, I'm sure. I do want to share with you I'm probably speaking to the crowd here, but speak with you a few words about the Friends of the Library. Friends not only puts on the Book Sandwiched In and Travels with Tulsans, which is coming up. We also sponsor the Adult Creative Writing Contest each year and assist with promoting Great Decisions, which is still forming, by the way. A foreign and domestic policy study group with multiple groups throughout the city. So, if you are not already a friend, we have membership forms right over there on the counter. You can become a member for as little as $15. Now, those dues help to continue these great programs and the multiple activities. Thank you very much for being here. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Jake Krumwiede is the executive director of the Oklahoma Museum of Popular Culture, which I like to say, OK Pop. Jake got his start at the Will Rogers Memorial Museum in Claremore, Oklahoma in 2007, which activated his interest in Oklahoma-inspired popular culture. Received a bachelor's degree in history from Rogers State University in Claremore and a master's in American history from Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. He served as the assistant director at the Will Rogers Memorial Museum and the executive director in executive director of the Cherokee Strip Regional Heritage Center in Enid, which, by the way, is definitely worth a visit, before coming to OK Pop in 2023. Jake has also taught college courses in United States history and the history of the American West for Rogers State University and Northwestern Oklahoma State University. And now, here to talk about The Demon of Unrest is Jake.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Right before she got up to introduce me, I thought, this is a perfect time for me to grab a little snack. And so I was stuffing my face. So luckily, I got through it. But thank you for having me, first off. So yeah, as she said, my name is Jake Krumwiede, Executive Director at the OK Pop Museum. So I've taught history at Northwestern Oklahoma State, Rogers State University. When I was in graduate school, really my focus started out as the American Civil War, specifically the American Civil War in Indian Territory. And I have diverged from that quite a bit in my career, including in graduate school when I started to focus a little bit more on pop culture, history of the American West, that sort of thing. But I say all that to say, the Civil War is still very near and dear to my heart, so I'm glad I got to talk about this book. Real quick, before I get too carried away, have you all read this book? Okay, great. I wasn't sure if it was come and listen to get a teaser, a taste of what the book might be about, or if it was more like, okay, you are familiar with what's going on. Good. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other things kind of surrounding that time period that I think are pretty relevant to the narrative that Erik Larson crafts. And I got to say, has anyone else read any of other Erik Larson's books? Which ones? The Devil in the White City is, yeah. Really a fantastic writer. And I will say, too, the reason I stopped, I kind of got away from military history and the history of the Civil War specifically is there are, especially with more academic historians, they're very dry writers and they're so boring to read about. I just got like, I can't do this anymore. But it's always good when you actually have somebody that is a very good writer writing about a topic. And I really felt like Erik Larson does a really great job of storytelling and just taking, you know, primary sources that are coming from that time period, direct accounts, and crafting them into a narrative style. So where you're not feeling like, okay, this feels a little bit made up. It all feels very real. It is all based in those primary sources. And I'll say not every author that writes about historical topics does that. So I really do appreciate Erik Larson and his work. So I'll say that just to start off. So I do encourage you, if you haven't read anything else by him, I would really encourage you to. Devil in the White City is really, really great. But this specific book, it's focusing on a very tightly defined period of time, right? It is focusing on really this kind of buildup between the election of 1860 going all the way up to the firing on Fort Sumter, obviously, and kind of everything in between then, and using some of these character stories pretty much as a way to do that. So it's before I get too carried away in the book itself, I did want to talk about a little bit about the American South itself and really the lead up to the American Civil War. So, of course, when we're talking about the firing in Fort Sumter, when we're talking about 1860, 1861, I will start my talk with the English Civil War, going all the way back to the 17th century. But really, I do think it is an important part to really understand the Southern psyche, right? Who the Southerners actually were, why they acted the way that they did. Because honestly, it is fascinating to, once you start to understand who the Southerners were, what their history was like, what their culture was going back a long time, going back to the colonial period and before, you really start to understand the antebellum South a little bit more. And I will really, the American South, even to this day. So I teach both U.S. history up to 1877 to Reconstruction and, the basic U.S. survey courses, U.S. history since 1877 as well. And I really do feel like we do a disservice to the overall narrative of slavery in the United States and the history of kind of our relationship with formerly enslaved people, going all the way up to present day. Because we have split them up into these two very separate courses, and we've been doing that for a long time, they really do feel like, well, this is ancient history, and everything else is kind of a very separate narrative, and it's really not. I mean, when you're thinking about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, I mean, that's just 100 years away, like 1-2 generations away from people that were enslaved. It's really the same story. But so when I say, I think it's important to understand the Southern psyche a little bit, it really does follow through to today to a little bit too. So the English Civil War, I'm not going to get too in the weeds here, but this English Civil War was really a number of different wars, right? A couple different conflicts going back from 1642, really all the way into even the Anglo-Dutch War, started in 1652. But in the middle there, after the Third Civil War, English Civil War, Charles I is executed and Charles II is exiled, right? Okay, what does this have to do with tea in China and specifically slavery in the United States? Well, I'm glad you asked. So by the time we get to English Restoration, by the time we get into 1660 and beyond, the monarchy is restored and Charles II comes back, right? So the colonization period has already started happening. There are already English colonies here in what is now the United States. And so as the monarchy is starting to reward those people that were loyal to the crown, they were giving them land grants in the United States, which ended up being in what is now the American South. Okay, so the people that are starting to populate the American South, English aristocracy. So you start to understand the really rigid class structure that starts to develop with Southerners. And once you kind of understand that basic concept, everything starts to make sense a little bit. Now, like I said, very rigid class system. That's not just slavery. That's a lot of things, actually. I mean, at the very top, you have the planters. Those are the the genteel, the Southern gentleman. You kind of know the stereotype, but there are a lot of others within that rigid class structure. And but it's more important, really, at the top there is that planter class, which is really, like I said, going back, it's the Americanized version of the English aristocracy. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. They really did have a very strict code of honor. I mean, these are the Cavaliers. These are people going back to the English aristocracy. And so this rigid code of honor is still there, right? They really did believe that their way of life was superior. Including slavery for that matter. They had a very honor and sort of, I don't want to say ethical way of thinking, because that's not exactly true. But they did have a very strict code. They believed that by the time we're getting into the American Civil War, they really did believe that the Northerners were the ones that were a little more morally suspect. They were factories, greedy bankers and factory owners that were treating their workers terribly. In their perspective, the Southerners were, it's kind of the happy slave myth, that they really believed that they were taking care of their slaves. And so they really did have this belief, deep-rooted belief, that they were morally superior as well. If there's another really great book, it's actually a condensed version of a tome that's about that thick. It's called Honor and Violence in the Old South. I really recommend it. It's by Wyatt Bertram Brown, really looking into that Southern psyche that I've been talking about here. So if you find any of that interesting, I really recommend you take a look at that. Okay, so let's get into South Carolina a little bit first. Obviously, the South, their economy is specifically agriculture. Almost to a fault, it's specifically agriculture. There is not a lot of anything else, certainly not industry. There are some cities, but there aren't many very large cities. Most of the big cities in the colonial period, all the way through into the antebellum period, the bigger cities are in the north, much more population in the north. And almost exclusively their economy is agricultural based. And by the time the cotton engine is invented, then it really is shifting to specifically cotton. I think everyone knows that story. I will say that I'm always kind of a little bit annoyed. Every single history textbook I see, they show a picture of a cotton gin, and it's this little box about this big with a little hand crank. That's not really what they were. The gin is meant for engine. They're usually these big, more kind of industrial sized, steam driven engines that are separating the cotton from the seeds. But it really revolutionizes the way that they are making profit on cotton. Cotton wasn't all that profitable before that. It became extremely profitable after. And so kind of keep that in mind. The English aristocracy transplanted into the American South. And this industry produced a lot of wealth. Think about the American South in the antebellum period. kind of like, I don't know, Oklahoma, the oil boom is very similar. And you think about the wealth that was just kind of pouring into a very limited, very narrow class of people. And it's all kind of building and reinforcing this idea of a way of life, right? We still hear that in the South today. By the way, I'll just say this too. We're from Oklahoma. We are not Southerners. We are Westerners, by God. But you still see that a lot in the American South today. South Carolina specifically, though, especially those coastal states. In fact, I'm going to skip ahead. There we go. All right. So a lot of these coastal, kind of the Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, as those colonies are being established, what's the big crop in the colonial period for the South? Tobacco. Tobacco is incredibly rough on the soil. Okay. So at that point, 100+ years, almost 200 years of cultivating tobacco, it really destroyed the soil in a lot of those coastal areas. So by the time we get to when you start to think about the American South and cotton, that's really in the deep South down here. A lot of these states up here had really kind of the soil had been decimated. There were some cotton plantations. It just wasn't quite as profitable and as widespread as it was in the deep South. Okay. And also for South Carolina specifically, there was really a lot of struggle within South Carolina, specifically in the antebellum period. They were hit fairly hard by the Panic of 1819. There was the nullification crisis was I'm not going to get into the details of all of these, but basically the Panic of 1819 it was really hard on agriculture and specifically cotton. And so there was a little bit of an economic decline, especially in some of those more northern southern states. And certainly South Carolina was a part of that too. In fact, in the 1820s, 1830s, into the 1840s, each decade there was a decline in population in South Carolina. More people, when you come to South, if they were immigrating into the United States, well, first off, it was typically in the northern states for that matter. But as people were coming into South Carolina, they were not staying. They were moving on to the deep South, more likely. They were moving west. And so South Carolina was a very it's a reason that they were kind of the tinder bed of the Civil War and the nullification crisis about 2 decades before that. There was a little bit of an economic force that went behind that as well. So why South Carolina? That's part of it. Okay. Now, getting to leading up to the American Civil War, there's a couple of things I wanted to go in real quick as well. Westward expansion, that's an important part of what is kind of getting us to the American Civil War. The more territory out west, the hope is that that's where slavery can expand. The Southern psyche was so very fragile and getting to the point it was paranoid as you're getting into the 1850s, 1840s as well, that there was not enough land for slavery to expand. In fact, right here, you can kind of see this line. This was the 36-degree 30 parallel line. Everything above that, slavery was outlawed. Anything below that, slavery was permitted. That didn't really give the South a lot of room to expand slavery. Why was that important? Anybody? It was about representation in Congress and in the Senate. If you, a lot more northern states that can develop up there in the north, right? And there was always this fear that the more representation there was in the north, the more likely that they would abolish slavery, and it would completely bring their whole way of life down, right? So there's that economy engine, there's that identity engine, right? Like, it's who they were. It's their going back to like this pride and honor. And once that's threatened, they start to get a little bit wild. The nullification crisis was almost the American Civil War starting in the mid 1830s. We were on the brink in 1850s as well, following the Mexican-American War, once all this territory came into the domain of the United States. And so, getting back to the book itself, Erik Larson, I think there's one thing I somewhat disagree with him. He kind of has this attitude that civil war itself was something that was avoidable. And I think that's great. It's very optimistic, right? That, everything can be avoided if we just kind of can talk and come together. And that's not realistic, I don't think. And just looking at all of American history up to that point, we were on the brink of civil war, and there was compromise after compromise after compromise, and nothing that was actually done to solve the problem. I think John Brown said it best. The only way that they were going to pay for the sins of slavery was to be purged by blood. So I don't necessarily know if I completely agree with him there, but that's fine. A couple other things before I get to the book itself. So really getting up to the content of the book itself. We're coming out of James Buchanan's presidency there at the tail end of the 1850s, probably one of the more incompetent presidents in U.S. history. And it's mostly due to this moment in time. He had the opportunity to find a compromise, to try to do something every president up to that point had found some way, right? Andrew Jackson, for all of his flaws, pretty much told South Carolina, if you step out of line, I will come and invade the South and I will put you down. And that was definitely not what James Buchanan did. So coming into this era, there is not a lot of leadership. He's kind of just, not really a lot I can do. He was sympathetic to the Southern cause, but wasn't really doing a lot to preserve the Union itself, right? So getting to the election of 1860 specifically, this is an interesting part of the dynamics here, the why things started to fall apart. And it wasn't necessarily that Abraham Lincoln just really cleaned it up and won this election handily. If you look at Abraham Lincoln, he's a fascinating guy, right? Not a lot of experience. He had like one or two terms in Congress as a Whig back in the 1840s. He was unsuccessfully nominated for the Senate in Illinois, and that was kind of it as far as his political background and experience. But it was really the collapse of the Democrat Party at this point between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. All right. Northern Democrats, I'll say the Southern Democrats, they're the ones that more like your South Carolina folks, your Edmund Ruffin that we read about in this book, for example. A little bit more fanatical, a little bit more slavery should exist by right. It shouldn't be debated on. There shouldn't be any conditions. It should exist by right. And so the Southern Democrats were the fiery, wild ones. And then the Northern Democrats, they were kind of scattered all across the North, but a little bit more out in the Western states, in the Northwestern states. So Lewis Cass, he was a senator from Northern Democrat senator from Michigan, put together a concept, an idea called popular sovereignty, that slavery, get back to a map here, all the territory out here, slavery, instead of being, the line, the Compromise of 1820 line, the Missouri Compromise, instead of that line being the dividing line between free and slave, basically, as the territories are organized, popular sovereignty, the concept is, let the people in the territory vote and decide if it will be free or slave. And so that really is what creates a little bit of a hotbed that is the quickest past the Civil War, because you start to have the fanatics on both sides, the wild fiery slaveholding sort of minded people are going west. You have the people like John Brown, one of my favorite characters in American history, honestly, moving west as well. Bleeding Kansas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's kind of a bloodbath out west. You have all the crazies going to one place, and that place is Kansas. So it's kind of a wild time. But popular sovereignty. So the Northern Democrats are the ones that are more pushing for this concept of popular sovereignty, which is a little bit more palatable, I think, to gives an opportunity for let the people decide, right? So you have the split that happens in the Democrat Convention of 1860, where you have the Democrat Party splitting and nominating two different presidential candidates. One, you've got Stephen Douglas right there. He's your Northern Democrat from Illinois. He's the one that took Abraham Lincoln's Senate seat from him. Well, he didn't really take it from him, but you know. And then the Southern Democrats there, this fella right here, he was the sitting vice president, John C. Breckinridge. He was your Southern Democrat, right? And then, of course, you've got Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate. And then you also have a kind of a third party over there that actually did pretty darn well, considering all things considered. But it was the Constitutional Union Party. That was John Bell. And it ended up that Lincoln is able to win fairly handedly because all of the Democrats are splitting their votes between really, for the most part, two, but maybe even three candidates. So that is how we get to Abraham Lincoln. So, like I said, I find it really important to know and understand the why behind why things were the way that they were, right? Now, really what I like about this book is it is focusing in detail on this one moment in time, right? It's not looking at all of the American Civil War. It's not looking at all the stuff I just rattled through fairly, well, at least as quickly as I could. All of the history going back, it's really focusing on this specific moment in time and looking at the collapse of the Union really through the focus and the lens of the people surrounding the firing on Fort Sumter in this as the Civil War is basically beginning. So you have a couple of major characters. Obviously, Edmund Ruffin. He's you see him there on the left. There's another great picture of him, and I was actually considering using it here. You guys, I can't remember. It was described really well in the book where he is, he's an older man at this point. He is getting his photograph made, and he's got his musket and he's got his hat with the blue cockade representing the Revolution, and sitting there all proudly with his musket and his hat. And it's just kind of a funny, wild-looking character. And then, of course, you have Major Robert Anderson there in the middle, and also the commander of the Confederate forces, General Pierre Toutant Gustave Beauregard. But Lincoln himself, he's definitely present in this narrative, but really he's not the main focus. Really spending a lot of his time, Larson is focusing his attention on these other figures and their decisions and their personalities and what is really taking the country towards war, right? So it's what I love about this narrative that he's crafting, honestly, because it is based on these journals for the most part. Everything that he is saying where people are thinking something or feeling something is coming specifically from their journals. So it, like I said, going back to his narrative style, he's very good at it. And it's something that I really appreciate when it comes to this kind of writing for a historical text. But so, like I said, it's Lincoln is not the central character. There's a lot of others that are focused on, from Edmund Ruffin, like I said, Anderson, Mary Chestnut, of course, James Buchanan, his administration, and not just Lincoln, but really a lot of people in his cabinet, William Seward specifically. Um, and really, with the election of Lincoln is fairly interesting too. Lincoln is perceived as this fiery abolitionist, right? That's really not what he was. He was an abolitionist, certainly, but above all, his job, he felt, was to preserve the Union. He kind of famously said during the campaign leading up to the events in this book that if I could free all the slaves, I would do it. If I could free some of the slaves and leave some of them enslaved, I would do that too. If I could free none of the slaves and keep the Union intact, I would do that as well. It was about keeping the Union preserved. That was his primary goal. And if he had to do that, so the fact that he was perceived as this person that was going to bring slavery to its knees immediately there in 1861, that really wasn't the case. That was that Southern paranoia that was really taking root and getting out of control. So it's a little bit interesting that it came to that point, and more to Larson's point, going back to the idea that a lot of this could be avoided in a way. It goes back to that idea. It's really kind of more Southern paranoia, Southern hubris than anything else when it comes to what led to Civil War itself. I'm going to go back to the map. I like maps. And when I teach classes, 90% of what I have up on the screen are maps just because I like them. But it also kind of helps to flying at 30,000 feet, really showing and understanding why things are going on where they are. Not all of the states secede at the same time. We know that, right? You have a number of the states that slave states where slavery is legal that never secede. They are still slave states. They remain in the Union. You have a handful of them. You've got Missouri, and then kind of over here, you've got Delaware and Maryland as well. So these are Kentucky, not Maryland, Kentucky. And so you have a handful of these states that are where slavery is legal, but they don't technically leave the Union. Once Abraham Lincoln is elected, you had most of the states in the deep South will secede. A lot of these down here, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, etc. Once the firing on Fort Sumter happens, that's when a lot of those northern states start to secede. So Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Maryland. So that's kind of as how things are starting to unfold here. So by the time you get to the firing on Fort Sumter, it is the ceremonial beginning of the American Civil War. Even though, there are a couple people that died during they didn't die in battle anyway. So this was a bloodless battle, if you will, such as it was, where there was no loss of life. As they were actually abandoning the fort, there were two guys that died. They were doing a ceremonial cannon fire as they were leaving the fort, and there was a misfire in one of the cannons, and two people died there. So there were two deaths, and actually there was a horse that died on the I can't remember one of the other forts that was firing into Fort Sumter. So the loss of life was a horse and two men that were killed accidentally on Fort Sumter. But anyway, mostly harmless battle itself. But Larson, he's ending his narrative with the surrender as this symbolic explosion of this conflict, rather than going through the specific battle itself, or like I said, going into the Civil War itself following. And he's really focusing on these key actors and how they misjudged each other And like I said, going back to a little bit the stuff that I was going through, the Southern psyche, really misunderstanding and underestimating people's motivations, believing that this crisis would not escalate as far as it did. Because, I mean, at this point, every generation since the country was founded had a near civil war happen. I mean, there was the compromise, the Missouri Compromise. So 1820, it was awfully close then. In the mid 1830s, the nullification crisis, it was very close then as well. The Compromise of 1850, following the Mexican-American War, very close there as well. And I don't think anyone really took it seriously enough that this could absolutely tear everything apart and really understand the consequences of the actions that they were taking. So I think that's a important thing as well. But like I said, this is a book that I really loved. I enjoyed it very much. Even coming out of, I came out of academia. Well, I went into academia thinking that I was going to be in academia and stay in academia, that I was going to go through, get my PhD, be a college professor, et cetera. But I really had a fundamental departure where I really fundamentally did not agree with how historians presented history, really basically to themselves. Most academic history books, you'll never see them on a shelf anywhere. They're specially ordered. You can find them sometimes somewhere, but for the most part, academic history is history for other academics. It doesn't get out to the public all that often. And like I said, there's often a reason. They're terrible books, honestly. They are boring. They're dry. But on the more public history side, which is where I started to feel more of a responsibility, and was where my career started to evolve and go into where I'm at now, where it is important for us as historians, as professionals, to interpret history to the public, right? To know and understand an event, underscore why it matters, make it interesting, for crying out loud. And so I really do appreciate authors that do it well, because I will say they don't always do it well. There are some that are very good writers, not very good historians. There are some that are great historians and not very good writers either. But I think Erik Larson is really one of those that's very good, that's kind of right in the middle, that does it really, really well. So his narrative is really fantastic. Like I said a little bit before too, his research in this is really, really good too. He's got, I don't know if everyone's copy is exactly the same. I really appreciate it when they include a bibliography, because you can actually go and, check under the fingernails, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And, it's really, really well researched, and it's really is taking the perspectives of these characters, of these individuals within this narrative, taking it very seriously, and taking the research very seriously as well. So I found that to be really important with this book as well. I really believe that it's easy for, and Lord knows I do it myself. It's really easy for historians to get a little bit caught up on what is morally right, morally wrong, the good guys, the bad guys, and not really focus on individuals, their personal motivation, and understanding where they're coming from and why. I feel Larson is pretty good at that. Again, it doesn't always happen. Nor do I think it's right necessarily to just sugarcoat the past and be like, well, it was the way things were back then. That's not the right way either. But really trying to understand people, why they did what they did, is important to understanding what happened. And so I think Larson does a really good job of that. I really, really do believe that. He really avoids doing the villain versus heroes. I felt like he really stayed on really walked a fine line there between what is really easy to go one way or another. Um, and specifically with Major Anderson too, he had Southern sympathies. He really did. You saw the conflict where he was within this instance of the defending of Fort Sumter, um, and a lot of contradictions within Southern ideology as well. Were really treated in really kind of nuanced ways, which I really do appreciate. Again, not trying to give Southerners and the Southerners of the time, slaveholders, any sort of free pass, but like I said, it's real easy to it's important to really understand people and their motivations, and I thought he really did it well. But I really found this book interesting because, and maybe this is where it's really dangerous for historians or just people to start to blanketly kind of apply the past to the present. But man, if I've thought of this every time I have taught a class on early American history and looking at all the moments that we were close to Civil War, I couldn't help but make parallels between what we see today. And I think it's really important to understand the past and understand where we have been, those moments where we were very close to Civil War, and how we got out of it, what it cost. So as I was reading, I really did appreciate it that way, where, I mean, he makes the parallels himself, but he doesn't beat you over the head with it. It's not as if that's the purpose of the book. But it was just one of those things as I was reading it and going through it, it really did kind of resonate. And really every time I go through and do a lecture and study, early American history, it's something that I can't help think about myself. So, there are parts of the book that I don't necessarily like either, I will say. I think it is a very specific, narrow focus, right? It is just this moment in time. It's why I kind of wanted to go in to some of the details of the past and the lead up, just so you understand it a little better. I think there's a real balance in how historians do this, right? I have seen time and time again, it just annoys me of like, okay, I'm writing on this one very specific thing. I'm trying to make this one very specific point. Okay, here's 6 chapters of regurgitating the events leading up to something. There's a real good balance between what is necessary and what is a little bit over the top. And I felt like he was a little bit on the other side of that, where I'm like, I really, as I was reading, I was making notes. I'm like, I got to talk about this because this is something that was missed, or, oh, this is a book that I need to make sure that people are aware of. So there was a little bit of that as I was reading it, where it just kind of didn't jump out at me as like, he really hit the nail on the head, and this is a perfect, flawless book. Anyway, those are kind of my opinions of the book itself. I really didn't even have a good. How much time do we have? Did I go over question and answers too? Okay, a few. What time are we done? At 12:50. All right. I often joke that once I have been given the floor, I don't easily relinquish it. And so if you give me enough time and a microphone and a platform, I just may never stop talking. So I'm glad I didn't get too far, and I'm glad I didn't get into this evening, and you guys were locked in here. So I appreciate that. You guys have any questions for me or the book? Yeah.
You did a really good job giving us background about the Southern.
Oh, thank you.
Did Erik Larson include that in his book?
There's some of it. There's definitely some of it. And it's more focused on the individuals and their lives, I felt. I craved a little bit more of it. I just wanted a little bit more of it. And I think it wasn't the purpose of this book to understand the complete Southern psyche, but man, is it important to really fully understand it. So I think it was there. I wanted more of it. I'll say that. I don't mind saying it.